I pulled the RV off the narrow, dusty road and into the shadow of Dead Man's Gulch. The engine sputtered to a stop, and for a moment I sat there in silence, staring out at the barren valley stretching before me. The Ruby Mountains loomed in the distance, jagged and dark against the fading light. This was exactly what I wanted: isolation, quiet, and a place where the world couldn't find me. The RV had become my escape after Laura died. I could roam wherever I wanted, park wherever I pleased, and it felt like a kind of freedom. But now, sitting here in the middle of nowhere, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The place had a weight to it, like the air was thick with something unseen, something waiting. I climbed out of the RV and stretched, the dry desert air biting at my skin as the temperature dropped with the setting sun. Dead Man's Gulch was as desolate as it sounded. I had read about it in a ghost stories book I found at a thrift store, some legend about miners who disappeared back in the late 1800s. They supposedly saw shadowy figures in the valley at night before the earth collapsed and swallowed them whole. I didn't believe in ghosts, cryptids, or any of the nonsense locals spouted about this place. I just wanted to be alone, away from the pitying glances and endless condolences. No one understood how grief gnawed at you, hollowing you out until nothing was left. Setting up camp took about 15 minutes. I parked the RV next to the remnants of an old mining camp, a few rusted-out carts, the skeletal remains of a cabin, and a collapsed mine shaft disappearing into the hillside. It was perfect. No people, no distractions, just me, the desert, and the stars. By the time I finished dinner, canned chili, nothing fancy, the sun had dipped below the horizon. I sat at the small table inside the RV, staring at the book in front of me, filled with old tales of ghost sightings and strange disappearances, most of them from around here. The locals called it the Phantom of the Mines, a shadowy creature that haunted the valleys, stalking anyone who got too close to the abandoned shafts. I flipped through the pages, skimming over accounts of miners swearing they'd seen something dark moving in the fog just before disaster struck. I shook my head and closed the book. Ghosts? Shadows? It was all nonsense. Laura would have laughed at the idea. She'd never been scared of anything. Not the woods, not the wild. She was fearless. But I wasn't Laura. As I cleaned up, the RV's lights flickered. I paused, glancing at the ceiling. The light steadied again, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just a glitch, I told myself. The RV was old. Things broke. But the air suddenly felt colder. When I glanced out the window, I swore I saw movement, something shifting in the darkness just beyond the headlights. I stepped outside, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound. The night was still, too still, the kind of quiet that presses down on you. I scanned the area, the beam from my flashlight cutting through the shadows. Nothing moved, just rocks, dirt, and the skeletal remains of the old mining camp. Then I heard it. Faint, like the sound of gravel shifting underfoot. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. "Get a grip, Jake," I muttered. "It's just the wind." I turned back toward the RV, ready to call it a night, until I saw them. Handprints. Long streaks of dust trailing down the windows, as if someone or something had dragged their fingers across the glass. My heart skipped a beat. I was alone. I knew that. No one had passed me on the road for hours. No one was out here. At least, no one should have been. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The RV felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as the wind outside picked up, howling through the narrow canyon. I sat at the table, staring at the window, waiting, but nothing happened. The next morning, the RV was completely dead. No power, no lights, no water pump, nothing. I checked the battery. It was completely drained. It didn't make sense. I had it checked before I left. It was supposed to last for weeks. Frustrated, I spent most of the day trying to figure out what was wrong. But everything seemed fine. The battery had just died. By late afternoon, I gave up. I was stuck here for the night. I cursed under my breath. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just bad luck. I decided to go for a walk, maybe clear my head. The old mine shaft loomed in the distance, and I made my way toward it. The ground was hard and cracked, littered with strange deep marks crisscrossing the dirt. They looked like they'd been dragged by something large. Too large. At the mine's entrance, the air was cooler, thick with the smell of dust and rot. The opening had collapsed years ago, the rocks jagged and sharp. But there, in the dirt, were more of those strange marks, long, deep gouges like something had been clawing its way out. I backed away, chest tightening. It was just a mine, just old rocks and dirt. But as I turned to leave, I caught something in the corner of my eye. A shadow moving at the edge of the rocks. I whipped around, nothing. I ran back to the RV, heart pounding. That night, the first knock came just after midnight. A loud, deliberate bang on the side of the RV. I shot up, grabbing the shotgun by my bed. My hands shook as I loaded it. Another bang, closer this time. "Who's there?" I shouted, voice cracking. No answer. Just the sound of gravel shifting. I grabbed the flashlight and threw open the door. The cold hit me hard. The beam cut through the darkness. Nothing. No one. But then I saw it. A dark, shifting figure at the edge of the rocks. Its form flickered like smoke in the wind. It didn't have a face, but I felt its eyes on me. I raised the shotgun and fired. The blast echoed, but the thing didn't move. It just faded. I stumbled back inside, locking the door. The lights flickered, and then went dark. I sat in total blackness, shotgun in my lap, waiting, but it didn't come back. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed up and climbed into the driver's seat. Miraculously, the RV started like nothing had been wrong. I didn't wait. I hit the gas, speeding away from Dead Man's Gulch. The weight in the air lifted, the fog was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling I had narrowly escaped something dark, something still waiting in those mines. And as I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, just in case. Let me know if you need anything else. The Beast of Blackwater Ridge. I've always prided myself on being the guy who keeps his cool no matter what. That's why I was leading this trip deep into the Blackwater Ridge Manala National Forest. It was supposed to be a challenge, and I was ready for it. I'd hiked dozens of trails tougher than this, and I wanted to prove that to my old friends, especially Nate, who couldn't even set up a tent without breaking a sweat. But there's something about being miles away from civilization, surrounded by nothing but endless trees, that starts to mess with your head. As soon as we arrived, I could feel it. Not that I'd let anyone see that, of course. "Kara, you got the map?" I called out as we packed up the last of the gear. "Yep, but I doubt we'll need it with you in charge," she winked, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. I grinned. She knew how to stroke my ego, one of the things I loved about her. Nate, on the other hand, was struggling to adjust the straps of his pack. His face was already red, and we hadn't even started walking yet. "Can we take it slow, guys? I haven't done this in a while." "Sure, Nate. We'll pace ourselves," I said, trying to hide my impatience. Sarah, ever the practical one, rolled her eyes but said nothing. She was the scientist of the group, the one who'd be lecturing us about rare plants and ecosystems halfway up the trail. She was here more for research than the hike, but I knew she could handle herself. We hit the trailhead late in the morning, the sun already filtering through the thick canopy above. The first couple of miles were easy enough, well marked, a few uphill climbs, nothing too rough. Nate fell behind pretty quickly, as expected, but we made enough stops to let him catch up. By the time we reached our first campsite, the air had a heavy, oppressive feel. The sun dipped below the trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. The dense foliage seemed to swallow up the light, leaving us in a strange twilight. We set up camp without much trouble, although Nate complained about the weight of his gear the whole time. Our tents were cheap, sure, but they did the job. Sarah was meticulous, making sure her tent was perfectly aligned with the slope of the ground. "It's going to rain tomorrow," she said almost as an afterthought. "Clear skies right now," I pointed out, but she just shrugged. Night came quickly, faster than I expected. By the time we had the fire going, the forest had gone almost completely silent. No birds, no insects, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of leaves. It was weird. I'd been in plenty of forests, but something about this one felt off. "You guys hear that?" Nate said, glancing around nervously. "Hear what?" Kara asked, stirring the pot of stew she'd made over the fire. "No, it's I don't know, like something moving out there." I paused, listening. At first there was nothing, but then I heard it too, soft, distant, and low, A growl, almost like the sound of a heavy breath. Coyotes, I said, trying to sound confident. Nothing to worry about. They're probably more scared of us than we are of them. But I saw Sarah tense up. She was studying the woods beyond the firelight, her face set in concentration. I didn't like that. When I turned back to Nate, he was pale, fidgeting with his hands. Maybe we should keep the fire going all night, he said. Relax, Nate. We're fine. Nothing's coming near us. But the truth was, something felt off. Even I couldn't shake it. The second day was rough. The terrain started to get steeper, and the trail was less defined. Nate was falling behind more often, and Kara's enthusiasm was starting to wane. We pressed on, but there was a growing sense of unease that none of us could shake. Halfway through the day, we found something that made me stop in my tracks. A deer carcass, ripped apart and strewn across the trail. Blood, dark and congealed, soaked into the ground around it. Whatever had killed it wasn't hunting for food. It looked like something had torn it apart just for the hell of it. Nate gagged, turning away. What the hell? Kara knelt beside the body, her face a mix of curiosity and horror. This wasn't a bear. Look at the size of these tracks. I crouched down next to her. She was right. The prints were huge, human-like, but twisted. Something was wrong with the feet. Long, deep claw marks gouged into the dirt. I glanced at Sarah. Her face was pale, her brow furrowed in deep concern. This isn't normal, she whispered. We should go back. The confident TJ who could handle anything suddenly felt a sliver of doubt crawl up his spine. Nah, we're fine, I said, brushing it off. It's just some animal. We'll be careful. Let's keep moving. But I knew, we all knew, something was out there watching. That night was worse. We set up camp earlier, just as the sky began to darken. The wind picked up, carrying a strange metallic scent, something foul. The air felt heavy, thick with unexplainable dread. The fire crackled low, throwing flickering shadows on the tents, but none of us felt the comfort of its warmth. We sat closer than usual, even Nate, who had barely spoken since we found the deer. I sat there gripping the handle of my knife, trying to tell myself I was just being paranoid. But when I looked at the faces of my friends, I knew I wasn't the only one feeling it. Do you hear that? Sarah said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. We all went silent, listening. At first there was nothing but the wind in the trees. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, closer this time. What the hell is that? Nate's voice cracked, his eyes wide with fear. It's just an animal. I said again, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince anymore. But it wasn't. We all knew that. This was something different, something wrong. From the shadows beyond the firelight, something moved. It was fast, so fast I barely caught a glimpse, but I saw enough. A tall, hunched figure just beyond the ring of light, watching us. Its eyes glowed bright and unnatural. Kara stood up. I'm going to check it out. No, Sarah hissed, grabbing her arm. Stay here, don't be stupid. But Kara, always fearless, shook her off and stepped into the darkness. Kara, I shouted, grabbing my flashlight. I scanned the darkness, then I saw it. A tall, gaunt creature with dark, leathery skin and glowing red eyes. It lunged. Kara screamed. We ran, and we never saw her again. The road into the Adirondacks was long, winding, and empty, just how I liked it. After a few hours of driving, I pulled the RV off the narrow trail and into a small clearing by the lake. The pines stretched high and thick around me, their dark green needles blending into the overcast sky. This was exactly what I needed, complete isolation. No people, no noise, just the quiet of the forest and the sound of my own thoughts. I parked the RV, turned off the engine, and stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp, with the faint smell of pine and damp earth. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant ripple of water. Perfect. This place would give me the quiet I craved, a chance to think without the distractions of civilian life. Ever since leaving the military, I've been chasing peace, and this felt like it could be the spot where I'd finally find it. I grabbed my gear and went about setting up camp. It didn't take long. I'd done this enough times to know the routine. Gather firewood, get a small fire going, and make sure the RV was ready for a night out in the wilderness. As I made my way through the trees, something caught my eye. On one of the nearby trunks, there was a strange marking, a crude carving of a figure, long and thin, etched into the bark. I frowned, running my fingers over it. Just a kid's prank, I figured, probably a bored hiker from weeks ago. But as I moved through the forest gathering wood, I found more of them. Carved figures on the trees, all tall and slender, stretching higher than any human could reach. It was strange, but I wasn't here to think about strange things. I was here to forget. By the time the sun set, the fire was crackling softly, casting flickering light across the clearing. I settled in next to the warmth, staring out at the darkening forest. There was a peace in the solitude, something comforting about being alone with the sounds of the wilderness. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something. The forest was too quiet. No rustling leaves, no night animals scurrying about, just silence. And then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, I heard it, a soft rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I sat up, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. I shook my head. "You're just on edge," I muttered to myself, trying to dismiss the tension building in my chest. The wilderness could play tricks on you if you let it. I knew that better than most. I was here to clear my head, not to let it run wild. But then I saw it. At the edge of my vision, just for a split second, something moved, tall, thin, just beyond the trees. I jumped to my feet, gripping the flashlight tighter, and aimed the beam toward where I'd seen the figure. But there was nothing, only the dark outline of the pines swaying slightly in the wind. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, every muscle tense, waiting for something to step out of the shadows. But after a long moment, the rustling stopped, the trees swayed, and the forest fell back into its unsettling quiet. I forced myself to sit back down, staring into the fire, trying to shake off the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The next morning I woke early, determined to shake off the nerves from the night before. I grabbed my gear and decided to hike deeper into the woods. Maybe if I put some distance between myself and the campsite, I could clear my head. The trail was faint, barely more than a thin path winding through the trees. As I walked, I found more of the carvings on the trees, each one stranger than the last. They were everywhere, slender, elongated figures with no faces, all staring outward, all watching. The forest felt darker here, the canopy thick enough that the sunlight barely broke through. About an hour in, I reached a ridge overlooking the valley. The view was stunning, endless trees stretching out below, the mountains rising in the distance. I was about to pull out my camera when I heard footsteps behind me. "Morning," a voice said. I turned to see an older man, probably in his 60s, standing a few feet away. He was holding a bundle of firewood in his arms, his face weathered and sun-creased like someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, giving him a nod. "Not many people come this deep into the forest," the man replied, his voice low and rough. He looked me up and down, then glanced toward the valley. "You camping nearby?" "Yeah, just over by the lake, trying to get some quiet." He gave me a long look, his expression unreadable. "You should be careful. This part of the Adirondacks, it's different." "Different how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He glanced around, his eyes flicking nervously toward the trees. "There's something in these woods. People call it the Watcher. It stays deep in the forest, watching from the shadows. You see it once and you'll start seeing it everywhere." I laughed, shaking my head. "Local ghost stories." The man didn't smile. "It's not a story, it's real. People who see the Watcher, they don't come back the same." He took a step closer. "I'm telling you this because you look like you've seen things. You know when something's not right, and something's not right here." I met his gaze, feeling that familiar knot of unease tightening in my gut. "What do you mean?" "You'll know when it's close. You'll hear it first, and then you'll feel it." He turned, starting back down the trail. "Just don't stay too long." I watched him go, his words echoing in my mind. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as superstition, but the way he looked at me, like he'd seen the same thing I had last night, made it hard to dismiss. That evening, back at camp, the unease was worse. The forest felt like it was closing in, the trees towering higher than I remembered, the shadows deeper, darker. The wind had picked up, making the fire flicker and sputter, but it didn't drown out the sounds. The rustling came back, louder this time, and with it something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the darkness, but the beam barely seemed to penetrate the trees. The footsteps stopped as soon as the light hit them, but when I moved the beam, they started again. I stood, turning in a slow circle, the flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. My pulse was pounding, adrenaline kicking in. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone out here. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything. And then, just beyond the firelight, I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing between the trees. Its body was almost skeletal, its limbs too long, its head bent slightly as if it were watching me from above. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were hollow, dark pits that stared right at me. My blood ran cold. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking despite myself. The figure didn't respond. It stayed still, silent, its form almost blending into the shadows. I raised my knife, backing toward the RV. The figure remained at the edge of the light, watching, waiting. I reached the door, yanked it open, and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. For hours I sat by the window, knife in hand, waiting for the figure to move, but it never did. It just stood there, barely visible in the darkness, its hollow eyes fixed on the RV. At dawn, the figure was gone, but the carvings had multiplied, dozens of them surrounding the campsite. The same tall, thin figures etched into the trees like a silent army. I didn't waste time. I packed up everything, threw it into the RV, and started the engine. As I drove away, the carvings seemed to watch me, following me down the narrow trail, their hollow eyes staring. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the adder, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. But even as the trees thinned and the road stretched out in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the watcher was still out there, somewhere in those woods. It was still watching, and maybe it always would be. I had been driving for hours, the Mojave Desert stretching endlessly around me, barren and vast under the relentless sun. The road was long behind me now, just an empty trail of dust leading out to nowhere. Perfect. This was exactly what I needed, a break from work, from the grind, from people. Out here there was nothing but silence and space, no cell towers, no deadlines, no distractions, just me and the desert. I pulled the RV to a stop near a rocky outcrop and stepped out. The air was dry and still, the kind of quiet that felt like it was pressing down on you. I took a deep breath, inhaling the warm scent of sand and stone. This was my escape. No buzzing phone, no frantic emails, just the open sky and the endless horizon. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV in the shade of the rock formation and pulling out my gear. I wanted to explore before the light faded. There was something about the desert that always fascinated me, the way the landscape shifted from harsh to beautiful in a matter of hours. But right now, I was focused on one thing: silence. After weeks of being glued to my phone and running from meeting to meeting, the thought of being completely disconnected was a relief. No cell reception out here, no GPS signal, just me and the land. As I unpacked, I heard it. A faint sound, almost too soft to notice. A rhythmic beeping. At first, I thought it was something inside the RV, maybe an alarm or a piece of equipment malfunctioning. But after a quick check of my gear, everything seemed fine. The sound persisted though, steady and faint, like a pulse just beneath the surface. I stepped outside, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the desert was quiet. The only sound was the faint wind rustling through the rocks. I brushed it off, assuming it was some distant echo of the RV's systems, and finished setting up camp. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, I felt that familiar sense of calm wash over me. This was why I came here, to escape, to let my mind breathe. But that night, the beeping came back. I was sitting by the campfire, watching the flames flicker against the darkening sky when the sound returned, clearer this time. It was still faint but persistent, a soft rhythmic pulse, like something distant calling out. I stood, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily. Logic and reason were my tools, and they had served me well in the world of engineering. But there was something about the sound, something that felt wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped away from the fire into the darkness. The desert stretched out before me, vast and empty. I started walking, following the faint sound. The rhythmic pulse grew louder as I moved away from the RV. For a while, I saw nothing but sand and rock. The beeping seemed to fade, then grow louder again, like it was moving with me, always just out of reach. I kept walking, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night, but every time I thought I was getting closer, the sound slipped away. Finally, I stopped. My pulse was racing now, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The beeping had faded again, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the desert. The silence around me was heavy, almost suffocating. I turned back toward the RV. The fire still glowed faintly in the distance as I walked. The beeping returned, faint but steady, like a distant heartbeat. The next morning, the sound was gone. The desert was still quiet, as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Isolation could do that. The vast emptiness of the desert, the absence of any familiar sounds, it could mess with your head. I decided to hike further out, hoping to clear my mind. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, the sun already beating down on the sand. I grabbed my gear, making sure I had plenty of water, and started walking toward a rocky ridge I had spotted in the distance. Halfway there, I saw him, a man walking toward me from the opposite direction, his figure small against the endless desert. I hadn't expected to see anyone out here. This was a remote area, far off the beaten path. As the figure grew closer, I could make out an older man, his clothes worn and dusty, his face lined and weathered from the sun. "Hey," I called out, raising a hand as we approached each other. The man nodded, his eyes distant, almost vacant. "You camping out here alone?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, just me," I said, a little taken aback by his bluntness. "I've been walking for days," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You heard it yet? The signal?" I blinked, unsure if I had heard him right. "The signal?" He nodded, his expression grim. "You'll hear it. Once you hear it, you can't get it out of your head. I've been following it for days. It doesn't stop." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you talking about?" The man glanced around nervously, as if the desert itself was listening. "There's something out here, something that's been broadcasting for years. It gets inside your head. Starts with the beeping, then it gets louder. You'll see." I stared at him, unsure of what to say. He looked dehydrated, sunburned, like he'd been wandering the desert for days without rest. I offered him some water, but he shook his head and started walking again, heading back the way he came without another word. I stood there, watching him disappear into the distance, his words echoing in my mind. Once you hear it, it doesn't stop. That night, the beeping was louder. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound pulsed through the silence, steady and rhythmic, like it was coming from somewhere deep beneath the earth. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the sound was there, burrowing into my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, GPS, water, and set out into the desert. I had to find the source. I had to know what was causing the sound. The desert was pitch black, the sky filled with stars. My flashlight cut through the darkness, the beam dancing across the rocks and sand as I followed the beeping. It was louder now, almost frantic, like it was pulling me towards something. The GPS was acting strange, flickering in and out, as if the signal was being disrupted. But I kept moving, my footsteps crunching in the sand. The beeping grew louder with every step. After what felt like hours, I saw it. A structure, half buried in the sand, a bunker or a weather station, long abandoned. The beeping was deafening now, emanating from somewhere inside. I hesitated, standing at the entrance of the bunker. The door was ajar, rusted and creaking in the wind. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to leave and forget about the sound. But I couldn't. The signal was pulling me in. I stepped inside. The air in the bunker was stale, suffocating. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the narrow corridor, the walls lined with rusted equipment and old, faded maps. The beeping was louder now, echoing through the metal walls, vibrating in my chest. At the end of the corridor, I found a small room. In the center, there was an old radio tower. its equipment still faintly powered by some unknown source. But that wasn't what caught my attention. On the walls were symbols, strange, intricate markings that looked like they had been carved into the metal. They spiraled outward, converging on the radio tower as if they were feeding into it. In the corner of the room, I found a journal. Its pages were yellowed and brittle. The entries were short, scrawled in frantic handwriting. They talked about the signal, how it started with the beeping, how it got louder, how it never stopped. "It gets inside your head," one entry read. "It's not just a sound, it's alive." As I read, the beeping shifted, turning into a high-pitched screech that pierced through my skull. I dropped the journal, clutching my head as the sound rattled through my brain. It wasn't just a signal. It was something more, something that had been waiting, broadcasting, pulling people in. I had to get out. I stumbled out of the bunker, the sound still ringing in my ears. The desert spun around me. I ran, my legs weak, my mind spinning. The landscape warped, the rocks and sand shifting as if the desert itself was alive, moving with the signal. When I finally made it back to the RV, I collapsed inside, my head pounding. The beeping was now a constant, dull hum in the back of my mind. I left the desert the next morning, driving as fast as I could. The beeping was still faint, but persistent. I didn't look back. Even now, days later, back in the city, I can still hear it. A faint, rhythmic pulse in the back of my mind. Always there, always calling me back. The signal isn't done with me yet. The road into the Boundary Waters was a frozen ribbon through a sea of snow, the trees standing like silent sentinels under heavy blankets of ice. The RV's heater hummed steadily, but even that couldn't keep the biting cold out. I was deep into the wilderness now, the place I'd picked to spend a week, just me, the frozen lake, and the stillness of winter. I'd been coming to places like this for years, ever since the accident. The solitude was the only thing that seemed to quiet my mind. This time, I was here to ice fish, maybe snap a few photos for my nature blog, but mostly I was here to prove to myself that I could still handle it. The cold, the isolation, the memories. I pulled the RV to a stop by a small frozen lake I'd scouted on a map. It was miles away from the nearest town, completely off the grid, just how I liked it. I stepped out into the icy air, my breath fogging in front of me as I took in the sight. The lake was a vast white expanse, the ice thick enough to drive on, stretching out into the distance where the trees disappeared into a blur of white. Perfect. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV near the shoreline and gathering my gear for ice fishing. The cold had a way of creeping into your bones out here, but I didn't mind. I was used to it. I grabbed my auger, trudged out onto the ice, and started drilling a hole. The sound of the blade biting into the ice echoed through the stillness, sharp and harsh against the quiet of the wilderness. Then I heard it, a deep, low rumble that seemed to come from beneath the ice. I paused, the auger still in my hands, and listened. The sound came again, a low, distant vibration like the ice shifting far beneath the surface. I'd heard ice groan before. Anyone who spends enough time in the cold knows the sound of a lake adjusting to the freeze, but this was different. It was deeper, longer, almost like something was moving down there. I brushed it off and kept drilling. By the time the hole was ready, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. I set up my fishing gear, lowered the line into the icy water, and settled in to wait. The cold crept in quickly, even through my heavy coat, but I was prepared for it. I'd done this 100 times before, and the routine was comforting. But that sound, the rumble beneath the ice, kept creeping back into my thoughts. As night fell, I lit a small fire near the shore, the flames flickering weakly against the chill. I sat by the fire, staring out at the frozen expanse of the lake. The stars were starting to appear in the clear sky above, bright and distant. Then I saw it, a light, faintly flickering and coming from beneath the ice. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe the moonlight hitting the ice in just the right way. But as I watched, the light moved slow and steady, as if something was drifting beneath the surface. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but it was still there, faint and regular, like a lantern swaying beneath the ice. I stood, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the lake. The light seemed to pulse, growing brighter for a moment, then dimming again, always moving, always just out of reach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a reflection of something from the sky. But deep down, I knew better. There was no one else out here, no one who could be moving under the ice. The rumble came again, louder this time, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. I took a step back, suddenly feeling exposed out there on the open ice. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I turned back toward the RV, my mind racing. The light, the sound, something wasn't right. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back out onto the lake, determined to make sense of it all. The sun was barely up, and the cold was more biting than ever. As I walked, I glanced back toward the hole I drilled the day before. Something was off. There, by the edge of the hole, was a long, jagged crack running across the ice. The crack hadn't been there yesterday. It snaked out in a jagged line, as if something had pressed up from below. I knelt down, running my gloved fingers along the crack, feeling the cold seeping through the ice. The surface felt thin, too thin for the middle of winter. Then I noticed something glinting just beneath the ice. I leaned closer, peering into the crack. At first it looked like a piece of metal, rusted and sharp, lodged beneath the surface. I reached into the cold water, pulling it free. It was old, jagged, like part of a machine, but there was no reason for it to be here. The nearest road was miles away, and there hadn't been any mining or construction in the area for years. The metal was strange, sharp and smooth, like it had been cut clean. As I held the piece in my hand, the rumbling came again, louder now, closer. I stood quickly, scanning the lake. The light was back, faint but steady, moving beneath the ice, closer than before. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat break out under my coat. Something was down there. Something was moving. I backed away from the crack, my mind racing. The metal, the light, the sound, it all pointed to something beneath the ice. Something unnatural. But what? The stories I had heard over the years about strange things beneath the frozen lakes, about disappearances and creatures buried deep in the ice, came flooding back. I'd always dismissed them as nonsense, campfire stories to scare the newcomers. But now, standing there in the middle of the frozen lake, I wasn't so sure. I needed answers. Later that day, as I was gathering more firewood, I came across an old ice fishing shack near the edge of the lake that looked abandoned, but there were fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the door. Curious, I approached, knocking lightly before pushing the door open. Inside, I found an older man hunched over a small stove, warming his hands. His face was weathered and his beard streaked with gray, and he looked up at me with tired eyes as I stepped in. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Not many come this deep into the wilderness." I hesitated. "I've been hearing strange sounds under the ice, and I saw a light last night, moving beneath the surface. Do you know anything about that?" The man's expression darkened. He turned back to the stove, staring into the flames. "You shouldn't be out on that lake," he said quietly. "There are things beneath the ice, things that shouldn't be disturbed." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. The man sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "There's an old mining operation under that lake, abandoned long ago. They were digging deep, too deep. Some say they woke something up down there. Ever since, strange things have happened. People go missing. The ice breaks when it shouldn't. And that light, it's not the only thing that moves down there." A chill ran down my spine. "What's under there?" The man shook his head. "I don't know, but I've been coming out here for years, and I've seen enough to know when something isn't right. The lake's alive, it's watching you." That night, the light beneath the ice returned, brighter than before, pulsing like a heartbeat. I watched from the RV, my breath fogging up the window, as the rumbling beneath the ice grew louder, more insistent. I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever was beneath the lake, it was waking up. I packed my gear quickly, throwing everything into the RV, but as I started the engine, the ground beneath the RV began to tremble. The rumbling was almost deafening now, vibrating up through the frozen earth. I glanced out toward the lake, and my blood ran cold. The ice was cracking, long fissures spreading out from the center of the lake. And then, in the distance, the surface of the ice exploded upward, a massive shape breaking through. I only caught a glimpse, something dark and enormous, sliding beneath the ice again, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. But it was enough. I floored the gas pedal, the RV lurching forward as I raced away from the lake, the sound of cracking ice echoing behind me. The road was a blur, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I drove, I could still feel it, the weight of something massive beneath the surface, watching, waiting. When I finally reached the main road, the rumbling stopped, but the memory of that thing beneath the ice stayed with me. I'll never forget it, the way the light pulsed, the way the ice cracked as if it were alive. I left the boundary waters behind, but a part of me knows I'll never truly escape it. Some things should stay buried, and whatever's beneath that lake, it's not finished yet. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as if the forest was holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I'd heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps. One local swore disappeared and reappeared as if it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it, film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera, set it up, and filmed a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wander too far down it don't come back. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and folklore are fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy. It wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground, its surface covered in spiraling symbols that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving. The trees closed in tighter, and the trail became fainter, more overgrown. Soon it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping the camera rolling, but after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. One moment, there had been a clear path. Now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed I was in the middle of nowhere. No path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot. Me, alone, in the fog. Okay, I muttered, you've dealt with worse. I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser, the fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. I froze. The sound came from deeper in the forest, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then out of the gloom, a figure emerged. An older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. Hey, I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. You lost too? The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. I've been walking for days, he said, his voice hoarse. The trail, it keeps changing. Are you okay? I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. No one's okay out here. I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. What do you mean? The trail, it moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path. It's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave. I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. "Look, I have a GPS," I said, pulling it out. "We can find our way back." The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. "It won't help. The forest is messing with it." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get this guy some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago would be choked with brambles. When I looked back, trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, growing impatient. "The forest," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it's been here long before we were." I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees, thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct voices calling out from the mist. "Nate?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked Eli. He nodded, his eyes wide. "It's calling us." The forest, I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree, high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside, water, food like someone had packed it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around like he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. "We need to leave," he kept saying, "before it's too late." We pushed forward, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The whispers grew louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around, and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless, and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen, shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Back home, I reviewed the footage. I expected to see the horror I'd witnessed, the proof of the vanishing trail and the strange shifting forest. But the video showed nothing. The trail looked normal, the mist wasn't as thick, and Eli wasn't in the footage at all. It was like he'd never existed. I tried to tell myself it had been a bad trip, that my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had let me leave, but it hadn't forgotten me, and I had a feeling it was waiting somewhere in the mist for me to return. The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, immersed in the silence for hours, but now something felt off. The kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life, birds, insects, something, but the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet after everything that had happened over the past year. I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping the wilderness would give me space to think, or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had, until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique I'd brought along to mess around with in my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day. No stations, no chatter, nothing. Until now. I stood up from the fire, walked over to the RV, and ducked inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it. A voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers 1, 3, 7, 8, 9. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone. No signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment, then the numbers started again. 1, 3, 7. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere. Maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing. I was sure of it. But the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong. Like the message wasn't for just anyone. It was for me. I shut the radio off. My fingers were trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet, not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day, I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods. The towering pines loomed overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of gray through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals, just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static blaring from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones, like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back. 1, 3, 7, 8. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch, something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate, I shook it off and stepped back outside, trying to push the growing unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, tall, scruffy, wearing a weather jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You lost?" The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. "I heard it too," he said. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Heard what?" "The signal, the numbers," he said, glancing toward the RV. "I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal." My mouth went dry. "You've heard it too?" The man nodded. "I'm Ben," he said, stepping closer, his voice low. "I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static, voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working. My cell phone drained to 0 in minutes." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "What do you think it is?" Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. "I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer." I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals. Glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes, that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before. The numbers were clearer, more insistent. 1, 3, 7, 8. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes constantly scanned the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. "You think it's some kind of broadcast?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. "I don't think it's a broadcast at all." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I think it's a warning, or a signal from something out there." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A warning from what? Before I could ask, the static on the radio cut out for a moment. There was only silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then a sound, a soft rhythmic clicking, like something metallic tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest. And then through the radio, a voice crackled to life. "We see you." My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical. "We see you." I stood up, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, coming from all around us, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was alive. "I think we should leave," Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once I agreed. The next morning I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no note. Just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles. The battery drained faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind. 1, 3, 7. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected. An old, dilapidated radio tower hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides, but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, every step echoing in the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal, a small glowing device pulsing with an eerie cold light. It didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, it all crashed into me at once. An unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, like something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV, but the lights followed me, the clicking never far behind. But I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper, even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. It's been days now, and I'm still hearing them. 1, 3, 7. I can't get them out of my head, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am, and it's not done with me yet. I'd been driving for hours, the narrow desert highway stretching endlessly in front of me. The sun was a golden orb sinking behind the mesas, painting the sky in fiery hues. My RV rattled as the pavement turned to dirt, the road leading me deeper into the vast, silent expanse of Canyon Hollow. This was where I wanted to be, alone, surrounded by nothing but red rock and the occasional shriek of a hawk. I needed to clear my head, to find some kind of peace, or at least distraction. 6 months had passed since the accident, but the guilt was as raw as ever. I should have been more careful. I couldn't escape that thought, no matter how far I drove. Canyon Hollow was famous for its petroglyphs, remnants of an ancient people whose art told stories of life, death, and something in between. It was also infamous for its mysteries, tales of settlers who vanished, of travelers who never made it out. But I didn't believe in that sort of thing. History was history, nothing more. I pulled into the campground as dusk settled, parking near the edge of the canyon. There were only two other campers, an older couple in a beat-up RV several spots down. They waved as I stepped out, and I gave them a nod. The silence of the desert was almost unnerving, the kind of quiet that pressed on your ears. I shook it off and set up camp, promising myself a good night's rest before exploring the next day. That first night, I dreamed of the accident. I was back on the ridge, the rocks crumbling beneath my feet. I heard Alex shouting, his voice raw with panic. My hands reached out for him, but I wasn't fast enough. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight. The silence outside was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the RV as it settled into the cool desert air. I stepped outside for some fresh air. The moon hung high, casting long shadows over the red rocks. I could see the older couple's RV, their lights off. Beyond them, the canyon stretched out, an ocean of darkness. That's when I heard it, a faint voice carried on the wind. Ethan. I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was Alex's. Impossible, I told myself. Just a trick of the wind. I stood there for a moment, staring into the void before retreating to the safety of the RV. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. The sun was bright, and the desert looked almost friendly in the daylight. I packed a bag with water and snacks and set off to explore the petroglyphs. The trail was rugged, winding through narrow canyons and open plains dotted with junipers. The carvings appeared in clusters, etched into the stone with astonishing precision. Animals, spirals, figures locked in what looked like dances or battles. Then I found the symbols. Unlike the other carvings, these were jagged and erratic, spirals that twisted into themselves like whirlpools. They didn't fit with the rest of the art. Standing there, I felt a chill despite the sun. It wasn't just the symbols, it was the silence. No birds, no wind, just me and the rocks. When I got back to camp, the older couple's RV was gone. At first, I thought that they'd left while I was out, but their spot was wrong. Their folding chairs were still there, along with a cooler and a half-empty coffee mug. Their fire pit had ashes that were still warm. I walked over, calling out, but no one answered. The RV keys were sitting on the folding table as if they'd just stepped away for a moment. A heavy unease settled over me, but I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe they'd gone for a hike. Maybe they'd gotten a ride into town. But as night fell, the unease turned into something closer to fear. The wind picked up after sundown, howling through the canyon like a living thing. I sat inside the RV, trying to focus on anything but the emptiness outside. That's when I noticed the journal. It was sitting on my passenger seat, leather-bound and worn. I hadn't seen it there before. My pulse quickened as I flipped it open. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the entries chronicling the travels of someone who had camped here before me. At first, the notes were mundane, descriptions of the canyon, complaints about the heat. But as the entries went on, they grew darker. Something is out there. I see shadows at night, faces in the mirrors. I thought I was alone, but I'm not. They're watching me. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. Don't let them in. No matter what you hear, don't let them in. I snapped the journal shut, my hands trembling. The RV groaned as the wind buffeted it, and for a moment I thought I heard a knock at the door. Just the wind, I told myself. But then it came again, louder. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. The desert stretched out before me, empty and silent. But then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading from the ridge down to my RV. My stomach turned. That night, I barricaded the door with everything I could find. Sleep was out of the question. The whispers started around midnight, faint at first, then louder. They called my name, voices I recognized but couldn't place. Alex was one of them. I covered my ears, rocking back and forth until the sun came up. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed up as fast as I could and started the engine, relief flooding me when it roared to life. But as I drove toward the exit, the road twisted and looped, always bringing me back to the campground. I tried every direction, but it was no use. It was like the canyon wouldn't let me go. Desperation drove me back to the petroglyphs. I followed the spirals, hoping they held some kind of answer. The silence was crushing now, the air heavy with dread. And then I saw it, a wagon train, fully intact, crossing the canyon in the distance. At first I thought it was a mirage, but as I got closer, the figures became clearer. Men, women, and children in 19th century clothing. Their faces were pale, their movements slow and deliberate. I shouted, waving my arms, but they didn't react. As I approached, they vanished, leaving only skeletal remains of wagons and rusted tools in their wake. That night, they came for me. I sat in the RV, knife in hand, as shadows moved outside. The voices were louder now, pleading and accusing all at once. "Why did you leave me, Ethan?" Alex's voice cut through the din, filled with anger and sorrow. The windows fogged as hollow faces pressed against the glass, their empty eye sockets weeping black tears. They began to bang on the walls, the door shaking on its hinges. "You can't hide," they whispered. "You belong here with us." I thought of the journal, of its warning not to let them in, but the voices grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with guilt and regret. I clutched the knife, my knuckles white. Then I remembered the spirals. The petroglyphs had to mean something, a way out, a key. I grabbed Alex's compass, the only keepsake I had of him, and bolted from the RV. The shadows followed, their whispers echoing through the canyon. I reached the spirals and fell to my knees, holding the compass above the carvings. "I'm sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry, Alex." The air grew still. The shadows stopped moving. One by one they dissolved into the canyon mist, their voices fading into silence. The compass grew warm in my hand before falling still. The road was clear. The next morning, I didn't question it. I drove until the canyon was a distant memory, the horizon opening up before me. But even now, they're still watching, that someday, somewhere, the whispers will start again. Nobody tells you that being a small-town cop is just glorified babysitting. Not until you're knee-deep in chasing down some idiot for stealing lawn chairs off his neighbor's porch. My name's Jacob Spivey. I've been patrolling the streets of Silver Grove, Ohio for the better part of 10 years. Not a long time, but long enough to get a feel for the place, know everyone by their first name, and learn which drunk idiots you're going to have to drag out of the bar after a Browns game. It was 1997, a year that stuck with me for a lot of reasons, mostly because it was the year everything went sideways. Way sideways. Small towns have their secrets, sure, but nothing like this. So it all started when the calls came in about a group of kids gone missing. Typical small town stuff, you'd think. Kids wandering off into the woods to do whatever it is kids do these days. Hell, I remember sneaking into the woods as a kid myself. But this was different. It wasn't just a couple of teenagers disappearing after a Saturday night. We were talking 4 kids, all under the age of 12. They were out for a camping trip with some Boy Scout group, and nobody had seen them since they wandered away from the campfire. Naturally, I got called in along with my partner, Jared Granger. Granger, bless his soul, was as reliable as a broken flashlight, but he had a good heart, even if it was buried under layers of bad jokes and self-doubt. We headed out to where the kids were last seen, right at the edge of Fox Hollow Woods, a stretch of thick forest that everyone in town avoided, mostly because of the rumors. You've heard of the creepy stories, right? Every town has them. Fox Hollow had its share. The old-timers used to talk about strange animals, twisted things that shouldn't exist, lurking deep in the woods. Kids would swear they saw shadows moving just outside their vision. Me? I figured it was just the usual nonsense. You hear something enough times and it loses its edge. We spent the better part of the morning trudging through the woods, calling out the kids' names, hoping they'd come running. Nothing. No sign of them, not even a footprint or a half-eaten sandwich. And then Granger, in his infinite wisdom, decided to crack a joke. "Maybe they got snatched by Bigfoot Spivey," he said. chuckling to himself. I ignored him. Granger had a habit of cracking jokes when things got tense, but even he started to get quiet when we found the first clue, at least what we thought was a clue. About a mile in, we stumbled across an old beat-up tent. Looked like it had been there for years. Inside, we found a pile of old bones, picked clean. Not human, thank God, but something about it gave me the creeps. I radioed back to the station, told them we'd found a campsite, but no sign of the kids. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, telling us to keep searching, so we did. We went deeper into Fox Hollow than I ever had before. Granger was quiet by now, his usual jokes replaced with nervous glances over his shoulder. It was late afternoon when we found something I still can't explain. There was this clearing, completely silent, no birds, no wind, nothing. In the center of the clearing was a small mound, like someone had piled up dirt and left it there. It wasn't the mound that bothered me, though. It was what was on top of it. A pile of shoes, tiny shoes like the kind you'd see on kids. Some of them were old, dirty, covered in mud, while others looked practically new, like they'd just been worn yesterday. My stomach turned, and Granger looked like he was about to be sick. Maybe it's some kind of prank, Granger muttered, but I could tell he didn't believe it. We were standing there, trying to figure out what to do next, when we heard something, a rustling sound, like leaves being dragged across the ground. We both turned at the same time, and that's when we saw it, or him, I guess. At first, I thought it was a man, just some vagrant who'd been living in the woods too long. He was hunched over, his back bent in a way that didn't seem natural. His arms were too long, his skin stretched thin, and his head, God, I don't even know how to describe it. It looked like he was wearing a mask, but it wasn't a mask. His face was twisted, contorted, like it had been melted and reshaped into something almost human, but not quite. He didn't move right either. It was like he was learning how to walk all over again. Jerky movements, his head twitching from side to side as he shuffled toward us. My hand went straight to my holster, but Granger was frozen. Couldn't blame him. I was terrified too. But cops don't get paid to be scared, so I yelled out, "Stop, police!" The thing didn't stop. It just kept coming, slow at first, but then it broke into a run, barreling toward us faster than anything that should be able to move on two legs. I pulled my gun, fired twice, dead center. It should have dropped, but it didn't, just kept coming. Granger finally snapped out of it, pulled his gun too, and we both unloaded on this thing, but it was like shooting at air. It didn't even flinch. I wish I could say we stood our ground, acted like the tough cops we were supposed to be, but I'd be lying. We ran like hell, crashing through the trees, barely able to keep our footing. That thing, it chased us. But it wasn't just following us, it was toying with us, cutting us off, herding us in one direction, deeper into the woods. We finally made it to a stream, and I dove into it, figuring that maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't follow us into the water. Granger was right behind me, gasping for air. I'll never forget the look on his face, the terror that had replaced his usual cocky grin. "Did you see it?" Granger whispered, his voice shaking. "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. We stayed there in the water for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. It was getting dark by the time we finally crawled out and made our way back to the road. By then, I was starting to think we'd imagined the whole thing, that maybe it was just some kind of mass hysteria. But then we found Granger's jacket. It was lying on the road, torn to shreds. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, just his jacket, lying there like a forgotten piece of litter. We reported it, of course, told the chief what we'd seen, but you can imagine how that went. Nobody believed us. Missing kids, sure, but a monster in the woods? Yeah, right? We were told to take a few days off, clear our heads, but I couldn't clear my head. Neither could Granger. He stopped coming to work after that, said he was moving, getting the hell out of Silver Grove. Can't say I blame him. I stuck around, though. Someone had to figure out what happened to those kids. A week later, the bodies were found. Well, what was left of them. They were scattered through the woods, mauled, torn apart like roadkill. But it wasn't animals. No animal could do that. I know what we saw that day wasn't human, but nobody else does. Nobody else will. The thing that lives in Fox Hollow Woods, it's still out there, and it's not done yet. I pulled my RV into the secluded campsite just as the rain started. The drops pinged against the roof like tiny bullets, creating a rhythm that, under other circumstances, might have been calming. But as I stepped out into the chill, I felt anything but calm. The Columbia River Gorge was supposed to be beautiful, a place where you could lose yourself in nature and leave the chaos of the world behind. That's what I told myself when I agreed to take this assignment, a photography spread on the rare owls that called the gorge home. It wasn't just work. It was a way to connect with the wilderness my dad had loved so much. He'd been gone 3 months now, and I hadn't yet figured out how to deal with the silence he left behind. The gorge felt like a fitting tribute, the kind of place he'd have taken me as a kid, pointing out tracks in the dirt and birds in the canopy. But as I stood there, staring at the dark forest ahead, I felt more alone than ever. The first day wasn't so bad. The rain let up by mid-morning, and I managed to find a good spot to set up my camera near one of the gorge's many waterfalls. The cascading water was mesmerizing, its roar drowning out the world. And for a while, I forgot about everything else. That was until I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but it had a rhythm to it, a cadence, words I couldn't make out, but that felt intentional. I scanned the area, half expecting to see someone nearby, but there was no one. Just your imagination, I muttered to myself, but the words didn't convince me. That night, as I reviewed the photos I'd taken, the rain came back with a vengeance. The RV rocked slightly in the wind, and the forest outside the windows turned into an impenetrable wall of black. I tried to focus on the images, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One shot in particular stood out, a photo of the waterfall. In the corner, faint but unmistakable, was a shadowy figure standing among the trees. I told myself it was a trick of the light, just the contrast of the water spray against the dark forest. But then I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy. At first, they seemed far off, but they grew louder, closer, circling the RV. I turned off the light and peered out the window, but all I saw was the rain. The footsteps stopped, but the unease stayed with me long after I'd crawled into bed. The next day, I ventured deeper into the forest, determined to shake off the previous night's paranoia. The gorge was breathtaking, its trails winding through dense greenery and past cliffs that offered stunning views of the river below. I lost myself in the work, snapping shots of moss-covered rocks and misty trees. That's when I found the carvings. They were etched into a cluster of boulders, spiraling symbols that looked ancient. I ran my fingers over one, noting how smooth it felt, as if it had been worn down by centuries of wind and rain. At the center of the largest carving was a stone, perfectly round and black as night. It almost seemed to pulse when I touched it. I pocketed the stone without thinking. Something about it felt significant, though I couldn't explain why. The forest felt heavier on the way back to the RV, the air thick with humidity and something else I couldn't name. As I neared camp, I spotted a figure in the distance. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, standing perfectly still, facing away from me. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing. The man didn't move. I took a step closer, but as I did, the figure dissolved into the shadows. My pulse quickened. I hurried back to the RV and locked the door behind me. That night the rain stopped, but the forest outside was anything but quiet. The whispers came back, louder this time, accompanied by faint laughter. And then I heard his voice. "Ethan." It was my dad, clear as day. "Dad?" I said aloud, my voice trembling. "Come here," the voice beckoned. It was coming from outside, pulling me toward the trees. I froze, my hand hovering over the door handle. A part of me knew it couldn't be real, knew that opening that door would be a mistake. But the voice was so familiar, so comforting. It took every ounce of willpower I had to stay inside. The next morning, I woke to find the RV surrounded by a circle of stones. They were identical to the one I'd pocketed, each one perfectly smooth and black. My stomach dropped. As I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. The forest was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. And then I saw it. It stood on a rock, its form shrouded in shadow. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its posture too still. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. "Leave what you took," the figure said, its voice gravelly, deep, and laced with menace. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. What are you?" The figure tilted its head as if studying me. "Leave what you took," it repeated before fading into the trees. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I considered leaving, but the RV's battery was dead, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. I was trapped. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The shadows outside the RV seemed to move, twisting and contorting into impossible shapes. I clutched the black stone in my hand, suddenly certain it was the key to everything. "Is this what you want?" I shouted, stepping outside and holding the stone aloft. The Sandman appeared again, its glowing eyes fixed on me. "Leave what you took," it said, its voice echoing through the gorge. I threw the stone into the forest, my chest heaving. The Sandman didn't move. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the cliffs. "Come," it whispered. I didn't follow. Instead, I bolted back into the RV and slammed the door. The Sandman's form loomed outside, but it didn't approach. Instead, it simply stared, its eyes burning into me. Somehow, I managed to jumpstart the RV. The next morning, as I drove out of the gorge, the weight that had pressed on me for days began to lift. But the memory of the Sandman stayed with me, its whispers echoing in my mind. Weeks later, as I developed my photos, I found something chilling in one shot. A stunning image of an owl perched on a branch. There was a shadow in the background, tall, humanoid, with glowing eyes. I haven't returned to the gorge since, but sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear it again. Leave what you took. My name is Ellie Carter. I'm 29 years old, and I write for a travel magazine. This happened last October when I took my RV to Devil's River State Natural Area in Texas to research a piece for an article called Hidden Gems of Texas. I thought I was prepared for the isolation, the wilderness, and even the eerie stories about the place. I was wrong. What I experienced there still haunts me. I arrived late in the afternoon, my RV kicking up a cloud of dust as I drove along the unpaved road to the campground. Devil's River was stunning, crystal clear water winding through rocky terrain, flanked by sprawling desert vegetation. The remoteness was exactly what I was looking for. No cell service, no crowds, just nature in its purest form. After parking in a designated spot near the river, I stepped out to stretch and breathe in the crisp, dry air. That's when a sheriff's vehicle rolled up beside me. The man inside, a stocky, middle-aged man in a tan uniform, stepped out and tipped his hat. "You must be the writer," he said, his voice steady but friendly. "I'm Sheriff Hank Moreno. Just wanted to check in, make sure you're set up okay." "Thanks," I said, brushing dust off my jeans. "Just got here. It's beautiful." "It is," he replied, his expression softening. "But it's also dangerous if you're not careful. This place gets real dark at night, and the river is deeper than it looks. Stick to the trails and don't wander too far after sundown." "I'll keep that in mind," I said, forcing a smile. "Good," he said, tipping his hat again before climbing back into his vehicle. "Welcome to Devil's River." As I set up my RV, I noticed another camper about 100 yards away. She had a small tent pitched by the river and a collection of gear that suggested she was staying longer than me. She waved as I passed, and I decided to introduce myself. "Hey, I'm Ellie," I said. "Here for the weekend." The woman smiled, brushing her curly hair out of her face. "Becky Turner. I'm here for as long as it takes." "As long as what takes?" "The Devil's Light Shed," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. "You've heard of it, right?" I shrugged. "Something about a glowing light? Sheriff didn't mention it." Becky nodded, her smile widening. "It's an old legend. People say it's a spirit that lures travelers into the wilderness. Some call it a will-o'-the-wisp. Others say it's the devil himself. I'm here to find out." I tried not to laugh. "So you're a ghost hunter?" "Amateur paranormal investigator," she corrected, "and Devil's River is one of the most active spots in Texas." I nodded politely, but her enthusiasm bordered on absurd. Still, she seemed harmless enough. That night, I set up my camera to capture the stars. The sky here was unlike anything I'd seen before, a vast canvas of shimmering light. Around midnight, as I adjusted the exposure, something caught my eye. A faint flickering light danced across the river. At first I thought it was another camper's lantern, but it moved too smoothly, too deliberately. I grabbed my zoom lens and focused on the light. It appeared to hover above the water, shifting between white, yellow, and a strange bluish-green hue. "Ellie!" Becky's voice called out behind me, startling me. I turned to see her jogging toward me, flashlight in hand. "Did you see it?" she asked breathlessly. "The light?" I asked. "Yeah, what is it?" Becky's grin widened. "It's the devil's light. We have to follow it." I frowned. "Follow it? Isn't that the whole thing? People who follow it disappear." "That's the legend," she said. "But I'm here to figure out what's really going on. It's probably just gas or reflections, but imagine if it's something more." I hesitated, then shook my head. "I'm staying here. Good luck." Becky looked disappointed, but nodded. "Suit yourself." She headed toward the river, her flashlight bouncing with each step. I watched her disappear into the darkness, my unease growing. The next morning, I ran into Sheriff Moreno while hiking to a scenic overlook. He seemed relieved to see me still in one piece. "I see," he said. "Of course," I replied, though my tone lacked conviction. "Do you know anything about the devil's light?" His face darkened. "It's just a story. But I've had to search for enough people who went missing out here to know there's something off about this place. Stay close to camp, Ellie. Don't go chasing things you don't understand." I wanted to argue, to insist that I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but something about his tone stopped me. I nodded and promised to be careful. That evening I sat by the river, scribbling notes for my article. The light returned, brighter and closer this time. It moved along the water's surface, then stopped, hovering just above the far bank. "Becky?" I called, but there was no answer. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to her campsite, only to find it abandoned. Her tent was still there, along with her equipment, but Becky was gone. Panic rose in my chest. "Becky!" I shouted into the night, my voice echoing across the canyon. The light flickered, and for a moment I thought I heard her voice. "Ellie, help me." Without thinking, I stepped into the river, the cold water soaking my boots as I waded toward the sound. The further I walked, the brighter the light became, until it enveloped me entirely. I stopped, shielding my eyes, and realized I wasn't alone. Figures emerged within the light. Shadows of people, their faces hollow and spectral. They reached out to me, their hands translucent and trembling. "Help us," they whispered in unison, their voices layered with desperation. I turned to run, but the water dragged at my legs, holding me in place. One of the figures stepped forward, a woman with long, wet hair clinging to her face. It was Becky. "Ellie, please," she said, her voice cracking. "Don't leave me." "Becky," I whispered, my throat dry, her face twisted, her eyes darkening. "Stay with us," she said, her voice overlapping with the others. "Forever." Fear surged through me, and I fought against the water's grip. The light pulsed, growing brighter and hotter, as if it were alive. "No!" I screamed, pulling myself free and stumbling back toward the shore. The whispers grew louder, turning into wails that echoed in my skull. When I reached the riverbank, the light disappeared, plunging the area into silence. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, my heart pounding. The next morning, Sheriff Moreno found me packing up my RV. I told him Becky was missing, and he nodded grimly. "Another one," he muttered under his breath. I debated telling him about the light, about the voices, but I knew he wouldn't believe me. Instead, I handed him Becky's journal, which I'd found near her tent. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw the light flicker behind me. I haven't written about Devil's River. Some stories aren't meant to be shared, but sometimes, late at night, I dream about the light and the whispers return. And I wonder if Becky's still out there, waiting for someone else to answer her call.